Oh, Matt, I think you've missed the spot. Oh, hey guys. How are you doing? Today's story is all about how Jesus loves us so much. Now, sometimes when we love people, we'll do incredible things. We'll do things that we don't want to do. Just like how Matt is washing Miles's feet here. I'm sure Matt doesn't want to do it, but he loves Miles. And Jesus not only washed the disciples' feet in today's story, he was telling the disciples about what he was about to do. He was going to give his whole life in order that they might live. Isn't that such an incredible story about love? Okay, I'm going to pass over to Anna now, who's going to give you a bit more information about our story today.
Hi, welcome to my sitting room. As Jenny said, today's story is all about Jesus explaining to the disciples why he had to die. So it's pretty big stuff. Now, the first way he explained was using the example of washing some smelly feet. But the second way is he used the festival of Passover. Now, Jesus was very clever. He knew that he wanted to explain how he was going to die by using this festival. So he carefully planned that they would be eating the Passover meal while he explained to them. So to understand the story we're going to hear from Jenny in a minute, we need to know a little bit more about Passover. So Passover is this meal that the Jews used to remember the story of how God rescued them from slavery in Egypt. So there are 4 parts to the meal: the bitter herbs, the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the wine. So I'm going to talk you through all 4 parts. First, we have the bitter herb. So I'm going to eat a little bit. Yuck. Oh. So this is to remember how bad the lives were of the Israelites in Egypt. To remember why they needed rescuing in the first place. Ugh, not nice. Then we have the lamb. Much more yummy. So, to understand why we eat lamb, I'm going to explain to you a little bit of a story about Moses and the plagues. So, Moses had been going to Pharaoh to ask for freedom for the Israelites, and Pharaoh had been saying no. Moses would go to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh would say no, and God would send a plague on all of the Egyptians, but then Pharaoh would still say no. There had been 9 plagues in total by this point, and the Israelites were getting a little bit desperate. But God told the Israelites that this last plague, the 10th plague, would be the final one. This plague would be the one that would get them free. This plague would be that all across Egypt, in every house, the oldest child of that house would die all in one night. It's a big deal. The angel of death would fly all over Egypt and hover over every house, and the firstborn in every house would die. But the Israelites lived in Egypt too. They didn't want their children to die. So God gave them a way to make sure their children would be safe. Now, this is where the lamb comes in. So God told all the Israelites to take their most beautiful, perfect, spotless lamb and bring it into their house to live with them for a week. And at the end of the week, they had to kill the lamb that they'd been living with. They would kill the lamb and they would eat a great big meal. Tasty. And and with the blood of the lamb, sorry if you're a bit squeamish, this is where it gets a bit gory, they would paint the doorframe of their house. And that way, when the angel of death passed over their house, they would see that that house was to be protected. That house was to be left alone. So they would pass over that house, which is where this festival gets its name. So that is why we eat the lamb. Next, the unleavened bread. Are you still with me? So, we eat the unleavened bread because the Egyptians weren't going to like it when all of their kids had died. So the Israelites had to get out of there sharpish. The Pharaoh was going to let them go because he didn't want anything more bad to happen to the Egyptians, but he wasn't going to let them go easy. So they had to escape. And so God told all the Israelites to bake as much bread as they possibly could in one night so that they could pack it up to take with them on the road. And so, I don't know if you know anything about baking bread, but normally you put yeast in it and it takes absolutely ages to rise. And it's not a quick process. So if you want it to be quicker, you leave the yeast out and you get something that's nice and flat. So that's why we eat the unleavened bread. It's to remember that during this crazy time, God still remembered that they needed food, that they needed to eat. And he provided for them by telling them to make all of this bread. Then, last but not least, we drink the wine as a way of giving thanks to God who did all of this. Thank you, Lord. So, to summarise, when we hear Jesus talking about bread, about wine in the story, it's these parts of this meal. He's using this tradition of remembering how God rescued his people from Egypt to tell a new story about his own death and about how God's doing something there too. Let's hear more about that now. Over to you, Jenny.
What should we do for Passover? The disciples were gathered around together, discussing what their plans were. It was nearly time, and they hadn't done anything yet. So they went up to Jesus and asked him, "Would you like us to prepare something?" Now Jesus said no. "Go into the city, and you will find a man. When you find him, ask him that I would like to eat dinner with him, along with all of my disciples, and that the time is near." And so they did just that. They found the man, and they went back to his house. Now, it must have either been a really big table or a very cramped meal, because there were 13 of them all eating around, having their Passover feast. Now, although this was supposed to be a celebration, a lot of the disciples couldn't celebrate because they were really worried. They'd heard people wanted to kill Jesus because of how popular he was getting. Now, Jesus hushed them when he started to talk. "One of you sat here tonight is going to betray me."
Surely not me.
Surely not me.
I'd never do such a thing.
Jesus stood up and he took some of the flat bread that was lying on the table. He tore it and thanked God for it. He gave it to the disciples and he said, "This is my body broken for you." Then he took a cup of wine. "This is my blood, which has been poured out to forgive your sins and for the sins of many others. Drink this in remembrance of me." The disciples, in turn, took the wine and drank it, made the bread. Jesus then said, "The person who dips his bread in this bowl at the same time as me will be the one to betray me." Now, one of the disciples, Judas, was sat around the table. He suddenly looked very nervous and upset. He turned to Jesus and whispered, "Is it me? Jesus nodded his head. Yes, you are the one. Now Judas lowered his head, hoping no one else had heard what Jesus had just said. A little while later, after the meal was truly finished, Jesus got up, left the table, and changed clothes into clothes similar to that of a servant. He then got on his knees and began to wash his friends' feet. "What are you doing?" Peter said when it was his turn. "You're Jesus, This is something a servant would do. Why are you doing that for us? I cannot accept." Now Jesus said, "You don't understand right now, but you will soon." Peter still wouldn't allow it. "Jesus, you're too special. You can't act as a servant and wash my feet. I'm not good enough." Jesus said, "But if you want to follow me, you have to let me wash your feet." Peter then, realizing what this meant, said, "Don't just wash my feet, but wash my hands, my whole body. Make every bit of me clean, Lord." Once Jesus had finished washing, he then turns to them and says, "Now, go out and do that for everyone else."
Hi again, I'm back. I'm here to do a little bit of a summary because we've heard a lot in this story, haven't we? I mean, Jesus is going to be betrayed. Well, I think we're going to have to wait till next week to hear a bit more about that one. But there's some other stuff we've heard about too. I mean, there was all that stuff about bread and wine and foot washing. What is all of that about? Well, at the beginning, we said that this story is a story all about Jesus explaining to his disciples why he had to die. So let's look at that foot washing again. The foot washing was a bit icky, wasn't it? Jesus was doing something not very pleasant for people that he loved. I think he's saying that his dying is a bit like that too. He doesn't want to die, and it's certainly not going to be pleasant, but he's doing it for people he loved. So he's saying that he's dying for me and for you and for all of the disciples because he loves us. It's pretty amazing. Then there was all that stuff about bread and wine, and I talked a lot about Passover. What was all that about? I said that Jesus was taking this old story about a meal and making it into a new story about him dying somehow. Well, let's think about that a bit more. So, in the story of Passover, we see that through the lamb, God rescued the Israelites from slavery to Pharaoh. Well, I think the new story Jesus is telling might be a bit similar. Do you see? In this new story, through Jesus, God rescued the whole world from slavery to sin and death. That's amazing, isn't it? We're going to hear more about that next week. But for now, let me tell you one more thing about Passover. In Passover, it's tradition that the story gets told by the youngest member of the family asking lots of questions to all of the adults in the room. So this story's been a bit complicated today. So what I want to encourage you to do is, as the youngest members of your family, to ask your parents as many difficult questions as you can about everything we've heard today. See you next week.